Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. In this week's episode, I want to introduce a couple of new ideas that can help us understand the journey that people might go through in both individual and potentially relational recovery. So the DST model has a couple of key ideas we can look at in order to understand that picture, understand what that might look like a little bit more. First of all, we want to think of what we call the three plates, this image of keeping multiple plates spinning. And what the three plates refer to is the three different entities that might require treatment or require support and healing through this journey. So first of all, you have the person that built and maintained the basement. So that person needs to go on a recovery journey, starting with the compulsive entitled sexuality, the integrity abuse, ego work, attending work, and so on. And secondly, you have the intimate partner or the betrayed partner. So that's the second plate. The intimate partner has often incurred significant traumatic injury. And so there's a healing journey that might involve treatment, might involve support for that person. And then the third plate, you have the injured relationship itself. And that's significant that we are separating those three things out. The relationship we can think of as its own separate entity that has its own injuries that might need to heal and that will therefore require its own treatment journey as well. And one of the important reasons for thinking about it this way is that we don't want to get it confused. We don't want to rush into couples therapy before some necessary individual work has happened, or we don't want to just focus on individual healing and then ignore the things that the relationship might need on that journey as well. So it's very important that we're being clear when we're working with deceptive sexuality. Who are we working with, or what are we actually working on? So that's the first principle to introduce, this idea of the three plates, the person that built the basement, the intimate partner, and the injured relationship itself. And we then have a second idea to help us think about the recovery journey, which we call the 5 stages of DST. So the 5 stages of deceptive sexuality trauma. This journey can apply to all 3 plates, and so that's the overlap between these two ideas. We can consider what the treatment journey or what the healing journey looks like for each of those 3 entities. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview, a generic overview of those 5 stages. So stage 1 is the assessment, diagnosis, and treatment plan. We're trying to assess and understand the presenting issues. We're trying to build a plan, build a treatment plan, or a pathway for safety and for potentially moving forward. Stage 2 is stabilization, safety, and symptom management. We're now taking those identified issues from stage 1, starting to work the plan and move forwards towards stabilization, which is where safety can really start being built. Stage 3 is the metabolization or grief work. So that's where we can do the deeper ego work or the deeper processing of the trauma that's occurred. Stage 4 is then reconstruction and renewal. So this is where we can really start building something new. We've deconstructed what happened, and now we can reconstruct and perhaps become ready to move forward from what occurred. And then stage 5 is expansion and empowerment. This is where we can take those steps forward with this new self or this new relationship that we've built, and life can start to expand again. And this, in many ways, follows the same sort of pattern as various other trauma models would, where you start with stabilizing the trauma, you then move on to doing the deeper work to process the trauma, And you then come out of the other side with the post-traumatic growth, where we're looking to rebuild after having done that difficult work. So that gives a bit of an overview, and we can perhaps zoom in a bit now and start thinking about how this applies to each person or each of those three entities we spoke about. So starting with the person that built and maintained the secret sexual basement, we start with that stage 1 assessment, diagnosis, treatment plan. So we're looking to assess the presenting issues, to perhaps identify any relevant diagnoses that might be present, to do some necessary psychoeducation to understand the problems, and then to create a treatment plan for moving forward. And as I've described with this model, that will be primarily starting with the compulsive entitled sexual behaviors and then the integrity abuse behaviors. Stage 2 for that person would then be the working of that treatment plan. So I called it stabilization, safety, and symptom management. For the men that I work with, for example, that looks like stabilizing the CES behaviors, stabilizing the integrity abuse behaviors, starting to develop the attending skills, the ability to sit with the traumatic impact of what they've done. And that's a big part of the work. So it's easy to just rattle off these tasks on a podcast, but stabilizing the CES, IAD, developing attending skills, that is a huge, huge part of the work, and sometimes a significant clinical task. Then that third stage, what I call metabolization, for the men that I work with, this is really doing that deeper ego work. So breaking down the previous ego experience that I had, or the previous perception of myself that I had when I was living that compartmentalized life. Really breaking that down, metabolizing the reality of what actually occurred, of what I was actually doing, who I was, the behaviors I was engaging in, the harm that I caused. And in this model, we call that the mountain work, which refers to this metaphor we have of, imagine a soldier that's bombed out a village and caused great destruction and great harm. He's then tasked with climbing to the top of the mountain next to that village, being able to sit on that mountaintop and just look down at the harm that's been caused, really honestly, authentically look at it without turning away. And that's a very powerful ego experience, to really honestly look at that harm. Look at the harm caused by the secret sexual basement, the harm caused by deceptive sexuality, really being able to sit with that and metabolize that into my new ego, my new reality. So we can think of this as learning to deal with reality as it actually is right now. Then perhaps coming out of the other side of that, you have the stage 4, reconstruction. So reconstructing and developing that new, healthier ego, an ego that's perhaps grounded in integrity, intimacy, integration. These things I've spoken about more in previous episodes. And then in stage 5, the expansion and empowerment. Maybe learning to use the human voice in a more empowered and authentic way, being able to own one's story, no longer being a bystander, but perhaps using my story, my journey, to support others. So really expanding as we come out of that treatment journey. So that gives us a clearer overview of the potential journey for that person that built the basement, the journey they need to go on. And if we now start to think about the journey for the intimate partner, the betrayed partner, we're again going to start with stage 1, assessment, diagnosis, treatment plan, and an initial look at what is going on, what is the partner experiencing, what are the partner's needs throughout treatment, what psychoeducation might help the partner make sense of what's being experienced, and how can we provide a vision, a plan for being able to move forward from there. And then moving on to stage 2, the stabilization, safety, and symptom management. And again, for the betrayed partner who is likely to have experienced a great deal of trauma at this point, this becomes a huge part of the work. Stabilizing those trauma responses, starting to build a sense of safety, both through external boundaries and also through the development of internal resources. And that can very much start with just the safety in the therapy room, the therapeutic relationship. And whilst this sadly isn't always the case, a good therapist can provide a sort of anchor, a critical safety net to somebody in this acute phase of trauma. And then as the person is able to develop that stabilization, that safety, we can then consider stage 3. Again, the metabolizing or processing of what occurred, of the traumatic injuries, of the reality of the basement and its impacts. We use that metaphor of mountain work for the person that built the basement. And in this case of the betrayed partner, we're going to use this metaphor of eating elephant. So that might sound a little bit strange, but the idea is there's now this huge elephant in the room, this big trauma elephant. And how do you eat an elephant? Well, first of all, you have to turn to it and face it, and then you eat an elephant one bite at a time. So this stage 3 is about gradually breaking down, being able to digest that elephant, that trauma that's occurred, piece by piece. And doing that work, I want to be clear, it isn't about experts telling the partner what her story is, or trying to somehow fix it or make it okay. It's really about honoring and hearing her voice, being an empathic witness, sitting with and honoring the story as it's broken down piece by piece. And that's the starting point of how someone can metabolize a significant trauma story that's occurred. And that's, again, not about fixing, it's more about providing the conditions where that work can take place, where it's safe to do that work. And that can take a long, long time. So I'm never suggesting that this is simple work or quick work, but I would say that this is necessary work. We can then think about what stage 4 looks like, the reconstruction. So this is where that post-traumatic growth can potentially occur, where the person can use the internal resources that are developing through that deeper work, that grief work. And there's perhaps the ability to start building something new, to reconstruct a new sense of self, to be empowered by that developing internal sense of safety. And then finally, we can think about stage 5, moving to expansion and empowerment, continuing to find the voice, continuing to expand a life that has often become very constricted because of the traumatic impacts. So that gives us a little more insight into what the journey might look like for the intimate partner. And we can now consider that important third entity or third plate, the injured relationship itself. And once again, we start at stage 1, assessment, diagnosis, and in this case, an initial safety plan. So at this point, the primary concern relationally, if the people involved are continuing in the relationship, is an initial safety plan, initial boundaries, agreements around living arrangements, children or dependents that live in the home, and so on. So all of these things we can put in place to just try and get a little bit of stability at the start of the process. And then when we move on to stage 2, the stabilization stage, we can break this down into 3 parts when we're talking about the relationship. Firstly, there is the crisis management and initial stabilization, trying to build some basic safety. Secondly, we might then consider a full disclosure process if that's something that's decided upon and agreed to by each person. And that can be another critical part of building some of that initial safety and starting to address the power imbalance in the relationship. And then if we've gone through that process and done the full disclosure, that can obviously provide some destabilization again. There's all this new information that has come in for the betrayed partner. She now knows more about the hidden reality of the basement. So again, that can lead to another significant period of instability that needs to be managed with as much safety as possible. So those 3 parts would all come under stage 2. So initial stabilization, full disclosure, and then post-disclosure stabilization. If we then think about what stage 3 looks like for the injured relationship, the metabolization and the grieving process. So hopefully at this stage, the person that built the basement has done some of that individual work, really sitting with the reality of the basement, of the harm caused, and has started to develop a healthier ego through that process. And the betrayed partner has also hopefully been able to develop some safety and stability and some of the individual processing of that harm that's occurred. And now, if the conditions are right, and if a lot of that work has been done, progress has been made, we can start to do this metabolizing work with the coupleship, which can be some of the most challenging, but also some of the most powerful work that we can do. And similar to when I just broke down the stage 2 for the relationship, we can think of this stage 3 in 3 particular ways. So firstly, we can metabolize what occurred, the story of the secret sexual basement, the story of integrity abuse, of harm, of disempowerment. Secondly, we can grieve what we've lost, or perhaps grieve the loss of what we thought we had. And thirdly, we can metabolize the new reality that we're left with and consider what we can build again moving forward. So as a couple, we're processing what actually happened in reality, grieving the loss of the previous reality, the manipulated reality, and then processing what we're left with now, or the new reality. And I would add that whilst we're focusing on the relational plate here, and this is a couple's task, when we're doing this work, it's very much focused on the intimate partner using her voice, sharing her experience, and the person that caused the harm listening, being an empathic witness, being a safe container for that pain, for that story. So this is about, again, processing, not trying to fix, not trying to offer solutions. When she can authentically share her experience, her emotions, the traumatic impacts, and know that he won't turn away, he won't shut down, that can be a powerful healing experience. And this kind of experience can then provide the fuel or provide the energy for the stages 4 and 5 coming out of the other side. So remember, stage 4 is about reconstruction and renewal. Can we build a new relationship, having done that grief work, having really sat with what happened, having both done that individual work as well? Can we reconstruct a new relationship out of the ashes of the previous one? And then moving forward to that stage 5, expansion, empowerment, can we start expanding? Can we start growing together where we were constricted, where things were shut down because of the harm, because of the trauma? Can we now open up and feel empowered as individuals and as a coupleship moving forward? So if we zoom out a bit now, that gives us a very brief overview of how we can think about the stages of recovery. And then there's 2 more brief points that I want to add that I think are really important when we're having these kinds of conversations. Number 1, and it's critically important that you hear me when I say this. On paper, this looks and sounds very clean, moving through the stages: assessment, stabilization, metabolization, reconstruction. In practice, it is never this clean. It is a very difficult process. There are ups and downs. We might sometimes feel like we've moved forward. Maybe things feel stable. We're starting that deeper work. And then there's a big rupture. And we might feel like we're back to square one. And that might go on for some time. So these 5 stages give us a clinical outline, a way to think about and perhaps measure where we are and the progress we might be making. But I don't want anyone to think that this is a clean, linear process, and that if it doesn't look like this in your journey, then you're somehow failing. So the model is very clean, but relationships, human beings, are very complex. So that is a really important starting point to temper the expectations around this work. And then the second important point I want to add relates to these 3 plates that I've mentioned. So we're talking about the person that built the basement, the betrayed partner, and then the injured relationship. This does not imply that we work on all 3 at the same time, necessarily. And in particular, what I'm referring to here is it does not imply that we're doing relational work from the start alongside the individual work, because there's a lot of cases where that won't be appropriate to do. And that's particularly relevant because with this model, we're identifying abusive and harmful dynamics as a significant part of the problem. So it's not only a bad idea, but it's often actually unethical and even dangerous to be promoting relational work, especially if it's focused on reattachment and re-engagement. If there are ongoing harmful behaviors, if there is abuse still occurring in the relationship, that means the intimate partner is not safe, and efforts to encourage couples work in that scenario can raise all sorts of problems. And to perhaps put some more concrete parameters on that, with the DST approach, we would say that couples work is not considered appropriate if the person that built the secret basement refuses to accept responsibility for their actions. And by that, I mean properly accept responsibility. Not well, yes, I know I shouldn't have done that, but she also did X, Y, Z. I mean fully accept responsibility for their actions in building and maintaining the basement. And this is separate from talking about whether there were already issues within the relationship. We're not necessarily going near that at this point. If we are talking strictly about the creation and maintenance of the secret sexual basement, full ownership of that would be a basic prerequisite of considering moving towards any couples work. And then linked to that, I would also want to see that person accept that the ceasing or significant reduction of the integrity abuse behaviors is the primary treatment objective. So that is more important than the reattachment work, looking at couples issues, anything like that. The primary objective would always be the integrity abuse and dismantling any unhealthy power dynamics that it has caused or continues to cause. In the early stage of any couples work, safety must be the priority over the resolution of couples issues or perceived couples issues. And also I would say that both people should be engaged in the process. So nobody should be being pressured into doing couples work before they want to. And that works both ways. But I would particularly want to suggest that an intimate partner who has experienced great trauma and great harm should not be being pressured into doing couples work before feeling safe enough to do so. And with the men that I work with, I'm particularly looking for a demonstrated and persistent reduction in those abusive or harmful behaviors, or what we call the integrity abuse behaviors, and a consistent effort to work their treatment plan. And once we see that person is doing the work they're supposed to be doing, and that doesn't mean they are now perfect, but they are seriously engaging in the work and we are seeing growth, that's where we can start to consider, is couples work potentially going to be beneficial here? Now, as I draw to a close, there's quite a lot to think about there. 3 plates, 5 stages, but hopefully that's relatively clear and can give you some sense of what recovery and progress might look like from a zoomed out perspective. Remember again that in practice, it will never be that clean, but many people find it helpful as a bit of a guide. And another benefit of having this framework is to understand the steps that need to be taken for deeper healing to occur. And if we don't have that image, if we don't have that picture of what the journey might look like, the temptation might be to jump straight from stabilization to reconstruction, for example, without doing the deeper, more painful work in the middle. And sadly, I feel like we particularly see that in some parts of the sex addiction field, where the focus is almost entirely on the sexual acting out and achieving sobriety. And then after that, people can fall into the trap of thinking that a lot of the work is done. Even worse, the partner can then feel pressured to essentially get over it and stop dwelling on the past without having had that opportunity to really process any of the pain that's occurred. Each stage in this model really builds upon the last, and so we need to honor each part of that, to slow down sometimes, to be humble, and to move forward in a way that takes each of the 3 plates into account and focuses on a deeper, more holistic pathway. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.